Welcome back. We can start this second part of the session, of the morning session of this conference. And now I am very pleased to introduce Professor Massimo Reichlin, friend and colleague of this university. He's professor colleague of, sorry, I exchanged the other interests with mine. Professor of moral philosophy and bioethics in this faculty of philosophy, and his lecture is entitled, I cannot read, Naturalism and Realism. No, sorry. First person morality and the moral conscience.
Okay.
We are all friends. And sorry again. So 45 minutes, and then I will give floor to the public. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Roberta. And my set task is to bring you from the heights of the theological speculation to down to the earth of practical and moral questions, unfortunately. And first, let me say that I'm very happy and honored to be speaking at this conference, and thank you, Roberta, for inviting me to give this presentation. And the second point I want to stress, the second premise, is that I'm very much sympathetic with Baker's general line of reflection as it is presented in her book on naturalism, the first person perspective, and as it was summarized in the paper presented in this conference. I believe that her attack on naturalism is well argued, and particularly her defense of the first person perspective is as a non-reducible element in a complete ontology is, for me, highly persuasive. In this presentation, I'm going to do basically three things. In the first part of the work of the talk, I will stress some aspects that Baker hints to in our, particularly in chapter 9 of Naturalism, the first person perspective, and that is the link, the peculiar link between moral experience and the first person perspective, or perhaps I will say FPP, because I will be talking very much about first person perspective. So if you allow me to say FPP, is it clear? Perhaps. And a second point will be that focusing on some aspects of the human infant's early capacities for social relations, I will present some reasons for casting doubt on the neatness of the distinction Baker poses between the rudimentary and the robust FPP. And in the third part, I will use this criticism as a possible source of criticism concerning Baker's more general view concerning the relationship between persons and bodies. So, let's start from first point. One central contention in chapter 9 of Naturalism, the first person perspective, is quote, that nothing can be a moral agent without a robust first person perspective, since only persons can have robust first-person perspectives, only persons can be rational or moral agents. This point, I think, is very well taken, and however, it also runs counter to some recent suggestions based essentially on empirical studies of moral judgments. And particularly in neuroscientific studies, it has been suggested that morality is a much less complex phenomenon than we usually think, particularly that moral judgment is inherently based on our emotion and the emotional parts of our brain, that all beings showing some forms of empathy or possessing a system of unreflective automatic emotions can be roughly considered as moral beings. Moreover, that the research and neuroscientific basis of moral judgment shows that moral judgments should be essentially conceived as sort of gut feelings, or perhaps the rationalization of gut feelings, in particularly in so-called dual system models, according to which moral judgments are sort of automatic and unreflective emotive reactions, perhaps corrected and integrated by so-called system 2 processes, that is reflective computational processes or cognitive processes. Of course, it would be wrong to simply neglect the importance of these scientific findings, and I will use some of that in the following parts of my talk, for an adequate understanding of morals. However, it must be stressed that reconstructions such as these account in a very partial way for the whole of moral experience. The lesson to be learned, no doubt, is that morality has its roots in the deep structures of our sentimental brain. However, the recent focus on emotive automatic processes, or on the double process view, leaves much out of consideration. In fact, I believe that the concept of morality with which these studies are working is unduly centered on the specific, on very specific cases, on quandary cases, on often dramatic cases, and sometimes even very bizarre situations, such as those everyone knows dealing with trolley cases, infanticides, crying babies, and so on. But this focus fails to account for perhaps the most important part of morality, that is, the one that has to do with the development of much more general patterns of reaction and dispositions to act, patterns that crucially involve, I would say, an idea of oneself. To put the point somehow more bluntly, an account of moral experience centering exclusively on the generation of outputs in the form of third-person judgments on the rightness or wrongness of certain courses of action misses most of what morality is all about. And following Baker's point, we can confidently say that most of what such an account misses has to do with the first-person perspective. The basic fact about the moral point of view, I would say, is that it is not third-personal, or at least that it cannot be wholly accounted for in third-personal terms. It is an essential element in a moral evaluation that rightness and wrongness cannot be defined from a spectator's point of view on the facts, not even on supposed moral facts there to be discerned, there to be cognitively accessed to. And when I ask myself what it is right to do, I'm not contemplating the question from an external point of view. That is, I'm not asking what would be the best thing to do from the point of view of the universe, to use Sidgwick's phrase. What I'm actually asking is what I should do, and it's the I of I thoughts in Baker's terms. What are the best reasons on which I may act, and therefore on which I ought to act? Of course, we can say, and perhaps we must say, that gut feelings or sentimental reactions are a part or the beginnings of a moral answer to to the question, to the moral question. They may suggest an adoption of an attitude. But what is crucial, I would say, for moral experience, and what is distinctive of an authentic moral judgment, is the fact that I endorse that reaction. That I stop for a while reflecting on what are my best reasons to act on in these circumstances, and end up with the decision that that reaction is the most appropriate for me. This decision, in a word, involves the consideration of my practical identity as a moral subject. That is, the consideration of my personal values, my personal commitments, and ideas of the good life. Baker aptly suggests that a rudimentary first-person perspective is not enough to adopt this specifically normative perspective, since moral reasons are request to have some image of myself as myself. And I would also add an image of myself in the web of my relationships with others. So to eliminate or reduce the first-person perspective is also to reduce moral decision-making to a distorted image, I would say. The image of a sort of an evolutionary mechanism which is wired up in our brain in order to produce useful behavioral outputs as judged from the evolutionary viewpoint of perhaps the reproductive fitness of the individual and the social group and so on. A robust first-person perspective is therefore necessary to account for a plausible view of morality. Living a moral life primarily has to do with constructing one's moral character or moral personality. That is, with developing habits and dispositions to act, to react and to act, and to feel, to judge and to choose according to an ideal image of oneself and to an ideal of a good life. Morality, I would say, is first personal in its essence. It does not have only to do, and perhaps not mainly or primarily to do with producing consequences, even though, of course, it has to mind about consequences as well. Its main core concern establishing relationships with other people and adopting principles to shape our treating one another with respect. Morality has to do with the contribution that I give to the state of the world, essentially in the form of the kind of person that I want to be in my relationship with others. As Thomas Nagel famously put it, morality cannot be accounted for entirely in terms of agent-neutral reasons, that is, reasons that are valid and applicable whoever is the agent. There is a part and a fundamental aspect of morality in which agent-relative reasons are involved. That is, moral rightness and wrongness also depend on the fact that it is me who will be doing X or producing consequence Y. And the fact that I will be doing the action bears on my self-image. And it is mirrored in it and will accompany my self-conception from this moment onwards. So if the naturalization of morality is the project of translating all of the first-person perspective or first-personal or agent-relative part of morality into a wholly third-personal language, I would say this misses the point of morality proper and perhaps means explaining morality away. Now, the Western philosophical and theological tradition has an apt word, in my opinion, to capture this specifically first-personal character of moral experience, and the word is conscience. This is perhaps no longer a fashionable word in philosophical language. Nonetheless, we can say, or I would say, that morality essentially depends on having conscience in the precise sense of having a first personal view on our agency and relationship with others. The etymology of the word, helps us with that. For conscientia in Latin comes from cum scire. That is a particular kind of knowledge. It is knowledge of something that is not entirely separated from the knower. It is knowledge that at the same time involves an idea of oneself. It is knowledge that binds the knower, that directly involves the one who has this knowledge. Conscience in this perspective, as a first-person perspective on normative principles, must not be interpreted as equivalent to moral sense. Much of recent neuroscientific views, or perhaps meta-ethical views that draw very much on neuroscientific studies, have some sort of neo-sentimentalist or neo-Humean tone. Well, I would say conscience must not be interpreted as equivalent to moral sense, at least in Hume's meaning, as if all that there is to morality was feeling some pleasurable or unpleasurable sentiment with reference to actions and characters. Conscience, in fact, has not to do with simple perceptions, I would say, simple moral perceptions, but with the progressive construction of one's framework of attitudes and patterns of reaction in the light of our experience of interhuman relationships, and aided by the internalization of other proper looks and judgments on ourselves. This is a point that was critically observed by Friedrich Nietzsche, who famously said that conscience is not God's voice in man's breast, rather the voice of some man in man. And of course Nietzsche was, as always, was partly right, because the authority of conscience depends in part on internalizing others' reactions and judgments, so that their voice resonates in ourselves, and their gaze on us shapes the way in which we look to ourselves. But of course, as always, Nietzsche was partly wrong, because our conscience is the form of our practical identity, that is, of that conception of virtue and of the good life that we define for ourselves and we aim to instantiate in our choices and actions. In Baker's terms, we can say that conscience is also a product of our first-person perspective. I now wish to move to my second part, stressing the fact that there is a reciprocal relationship between conscience on the one side and the first-person perspective on the other. That is, it is not only, as Baker says, that the capacity to conceive oneself as oneself generates moral experience, but also the other way around, in a sense. That is, the initial fragments of moral experience are important elements, I believe, in the process of reaching self-consciousness and the robust FPP, first-person perspective. Some empirical studies showing the relevance of the emotional elements in the origin of moral experience are to be kept in mind, and more generally some empirical studies on developmental psychology. One important conclusion, for example, is that infants show very early signs of the distinction between themselves and the others, and very rapidly set out for the development of a sense of agency. For example, infants in the first hours of their life already distinguish their body from others, as is shown by their reacting more vivaciously to an experimental stimulation of their cheek than to a similar self-stimulation. And moreover, 4-month-old babies, for example, try to reach for objects that are being shown to them only within the limits of their sphere of the grasp. This shows that the body scheme, as mentioned also by Pawan yesterday, is a very early present to the initial consciousness of the baby. Of course, this is partly subpersonal, as Michael Pawan said yesterday, but it is nonetheless, I think, a very early sign of the beginnings of self-consciousness. Moreover, as I already mentioned, infants show very early signs of agency, as evidenced, for example, by experiments in which 2-month-old babies modulate their way of sucking a musical dummy according to the different sounds that it produces. These findings suggest that there is a very early experience of one's body, and that is a constitutive element in the concept of oneself as a distinct and original source of action. Moreover, as mentioned by Baker herself in her book, it is well known that humans possess a unique capacity for social interaction, cooperation, and mind reading, which is shown very early, for example, in the very, very early capacity that babies have to imitate and also to distinguish facial emotions. And we can also add that in a few months from birth, infants start to develop attitudes of reaction to others' behavior that are clear forerunners of social and moral behavior. For example, 2-month-old babies react negatively to the sudden interruption of an interaction by an adult, as if there was a sort of breach of the rules of cooperation of the game. And 7-month-old babies differentiate very clearly their social expectations according to the fact that they are interacting with some privileged person, perhaps their mother, or with an unknown one. The most relevant conclusion that can be drawn from this data is the fact that infants learn to identify themselves in the relationship with others. It is through the experience of the other's gaze and the very implicit realization of their being the object of others' representation and care that the sense of oneself emerges. So self-consciousness and the future development of the capacity for moral agency are rooted in this very early and peculiarly human interest for the way in which others see us and relate to us. We can perhaps say that the emergence of the self is tied to the social interaction of the human infant with other people, so that there is a sort of co-emergence of the ideas of the self and of the others. Now, of course, Baker would object that all this falls within the rudimentary first-person perspective, and that a robust first-person perspective does not emerge until the kids possess language and the capacity for I thoughts in the specific way in which she understands I thoughts. But it must be stressed, I think, that these early capacities to distinguish oneself from others, to interact with them in significantly complex ways, is in fact already a part of the development of a robust first-person perspective. It is not the case that the robust first-person perspective somewhat magically emerges with the appearance of language, it is much more plausible to think, I believe, that the acquisition of language and that peculiar capacity for high thoughts which Baker has in mind completes and perhaps perfects a process that is already prepared by very early experiences of oneself as oneself in a non-linguistic dimension. To put it bluntly, I would say it seems possible to have a very robust sense of oneself, even though perhaps not the robust sense that Baker has in mind, without having developed those complex verbal capacities that eventually express one's self-awareness. All this, of course, does not show that there is any kind of proto-moral behavior in very young infants. As I mentioned, I accept Baker's view that only persons may be full-blown moral agents. However, the preceding observation showed that the early social interactions essentially mediated by the experience of a lived body and characterized by an emotional load are vital elements in the formation of a robust first-person perspective. As Philippe Rochat put it, the process through which children attract the gaze of others while exploring the environment is a basic element in the development of self-consciousness and represents the ontogenetic roots of the human moral sense. It can be added that this progressively emerging conception of oneself as oneself is also mediated by specifically moral behavior. That is, of course, the adult's behavior of caring towards the infant. In this sense, we can say that the child acquires the conception of herself partly by learning to be the object of a loving relationship, perhaps by her mother or another privileged person. So the co-emergence of the sense of oneself and of the sense of others is mediated by these experiences of relationship and care and affection. So that we may say that in the primordia of conscience are one basic factor in the emergence of a robust first-person perspective. Baker herself says that the robust first-person perspective implies acquiring the empirical concept expressed by a public language, and that this implies to have social and linguistic relations. I would stress the social part of the relations and the very early social relationship, and perhaps incoitively ethical relations that are a fundamental element of this development. So, there are reasons to doubt, I believe, that the acquisition of cognitive abilities, and particularly linguistic abilities, is the only means through which a robust FPP becomes effective, because the pre-linguistic lived experience of the embodiment in a biological organism with the emotional and its sentimental experiences that this allows is a relevant, perhaps a vital step towards the establishment of a robust FPP. In other words, the acquisition of the concept of oneself, the fact of being situated in a bodily condition, of experiencing one's body as a causal factor in affecting changes in the world of things and persons, and of experiencing a complex set of emotional reactions and perceptions associated to this embodied situation are vital contributions to reaching the robust first-person perspective. And this brings me to the last part of my presentation that has to do with Baker's constitution view and her relationship between being a person and having a body, so to say. Baker writes that the human child must be considered, the human infant must be considered as a person because she has a rudimentary first-person perspective, essentially. And the reason why she has it essentially is the fact that she is of a kind that naturally develops robust first-person perspective. Whereas other mammalians who share rudimentary first-person perspective do not ordinarily naturally develop robust ones. And so that is the reason why the other mammalians have rudimentary first-person perspective only contingently. This seems to mean that you don't need to presently possess the capacity for a robust first-person perspective in order to be a person, according to Baker. It is enough that you have the capacity to develop a robust first-person perspective in your natural history of development. And in fact, in the paper presented to this conference, Baker writes that the dividing line between a human infant and a non-human organism is that the first, but not the second, has a remote capacity to develop a robust first-person perspective. That is, a second-order capacity to develop that capacity. Now I see two possible objections to this, and the first is that in the light of the scientific evidence, very, very sketchily summarized in the preceding paragraph, this capacity can hardly be said to be remote. As a matter of fact, I would say infants in the first year of age are in fact actively making their way on the road that brings them to the acquisition of a full-blown, robust FPP. Their level on the individual agency and social interaction is so high that they can be fairly be said to possess a stable sense of themselves, in a way that most non-human animals cannot be said. And there is in fact much more continuity between human infants and grown children that Baker seems willing to allow. And specifically, it seems that we can justifiably say that pre-linguistic infants enjoy some relatively complex form of inner life, so that when Baker says that without a robust first-person perspective in her meaning, there would be no inner life at all, this seems a very questionable contention. Though very young infants do not possess the robust FPP in Baker's sense, they do have much more than a remote capacity to develop it. And they have it in virtue of their non-linguistic embodied capacities. And this brings me to my second objection, which is that if being an individual with a rudimentary first-person perspective whose natural kind is such that it develops a robust FPP, and if this is enough to qualify the human infant as a person, then it is not clear why a human fetus should not be a person as well. In fact, we can say human fetus has consciousness, at least starting from about perhaps the 25th week of pregnancy, when the main neural connections are established. So satisfies the condition of consciousness and also minimal agency, and of course the human fetus is of a kind that naturally develops a robust first-person perspective. Therefore, we should conclude it is a person. And perhaps one could even go further and say that if being of a kind that naturally develops a robust first-person perspective is sufficient in order to be considered as a person, then why should being of a kind that naturally develops first rudimentary and then robust first-person perspective be an insufficient ground for personhood? To stress the role of being an individual of a certain kind, I would say, in order to grant the human newborn the status of a person is to accept, at least implicitly, that there is some ontological significance in being human. That is, being of a kind that naturally develops a robust FPP. So one might be tempted to say that at the time that the human individual is present, and then you have to decide when this happens, but I don't want to go into that, of course, what you have is a biological individual of a kind that naturally develops a rudimentary FPP during pregnancy and then a robust FPP within the first 3 years of life. This would partly reconcile Baker's view with animalism, of course, in that it would acknowledge the relevance of human biology among the conditions that account for what we essentially are. It would acknowledge in particular that embodiment in a biological body is a basic condition for the future emergence of the robust FPP, that is the distinctive mark of full-fledged personhood. Baker comes close to recognizing the importance of biology in her book when she objects to Descartes' conception of the self as a solitary thinker with no hands, no flesh, no blood. However, she insists that our body could be substituted by a bionic one, a wholly engineered body, a non-organic body, while we continue to exist so long as we have our FPP. I believe that Baker has too much faith in technology in believing that a wholly engineered non-organic body might support a robust FPP. Moreover, I believe that her position greatly underestimates the connection between my having this body and my having my first-person perspective. My body, I would say, is not a merely biological object. It is a lived body, and the very condition of my being open to the outside world, that is, of my having consciousness and a first-person perspective. What does the fact that my first-person perspective constitutes my persistent condition, as she says, mean? If it does not mean that such perspective emerges from this particular body. If the single fact that accounts for your being the same person that you were when you were as an infant is, I'm quoting from the paper that she presented last Wednesday, perhaps? No? Tuesday, perhaps? Is that there is a single exemplification of the dispositional property of having a FPP, both then, when you were an infant, and now. Is it not the case that such a first-person perspective can be the same only because it is a dispositional property of the same body? If this is not so, then what does this dispositional, what or who does this dispositional property belong to? Who or what has the dispositional property of conceiving oneself as oneself? If the minus of the perspective is not accounted for by my biological continuity, then it can only be accounted for by my psychological continuity, as in standard psychological views of identity. But this conclusion would run into the difficulties that Baker herself raises against psychological views in her person and bodies. It may be argued, oh sorry, I should have clicked this before. Anyway, it may be argued, I would say, that for all her insistence of the anti-Cartesianism of her position, in her refusal to consider the relevance of the body with reference to personal identity, a slight element of dualism still lingers in Baker's view. For my FPP, once severed from its emergence in my specific bodily condition, now seems an analogous either of a Cartesian soul that might be transferred in a non-biological body, or perhaps of a Puffietian collection of connected mental states that might be transported into another planet. Baker surely does not want to accept neither view. And of course she would also reject the partly animalistic perspective I suggested, but has she the conceptual resources to avoid this move? And more importantly, I would ask, does this partial reconciliation of the first person perspective with the relevance of embodiment commits us with embodiment, I would stress, in a biological organism, would necessarily condemn its defender to naturalism, so that the defense of an irreducible first-person perspective necessarily implies the Constitution view? I do not think so. It is persons, I concur, not brains or minds, who are subjects of experience or are rational or moral agents. However, we persons, I would say, cannot think of ourselves as ourselves outside this organic body. For a non-organic body, a bionic body would not be me, in that it would not support my FPP. Perhaps this is only an intuition, but to borrow once again Baker's phrase, it is a very robust one. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Massimo. Very interesting and important lecture. So we can start the debate, please.
Thank you very much. I thought that was a fine talk, and I do have several things to say, as you may guess. The first thing, I really appreciated your first part of the talk about morality. I thought that went further than anything I had said, but it's certainly, I would think of it as an extension of what I said, so I really appreciate that. Your criticism of the distinction between the rudimentary and robust first-person perspective, I think you, and maybe all psychologists, think that what's important is the development of a sense of self. That's not what I'm talking about, because I agree with you about the sense of self, and it's a long train before you get to what I'm thinking of as the linguistic, robust first-person perspective. But I do agree that there's a long train, and that language completes the process, but the process has been going on for a while. But for the sense of self, but then what's needed for moral responsibility, I think, is for you to be able to understand yourself, and that's what the first-person, the robust first-person perspective is supposed to give you. The third thing about your objection between my discussion of persons and bodies, I thought that was quite good. But I would like to, I do have a few things. One is your objection, your first objection is that a 1-year-old, I think you said, is on his way to reaching the robust first-person perspective. And I don't disagree with that. And I certainly don't disagree with the early social behavior of infants. 42 minutes old. Alison Gottlieb has done experiments with babies 42 minutes old. That's really, really young. Who imitate. They imitate tongue protrusions and stuff like that. They imitate. They can distinguish their caregiver from a stranger. They definitely are born with something like a sense of self in a way that they can distinguish self from others. That's perfectly primitive and perfectly something that dogs do too. So that's my internal standard of a rudimentary first-person perspective. Can a dog do it? Dogs are very social. They can imitate. They can do all the things you mentioned there. So that's not what I'm after. I'm not. So that's why I would say that's still a rudimentary first-person perspective. Your second objection: why a fetus is not a person. I think that's a somewhat a difficult one. I don't believe that there's evidence that a fetus has this minimal agency and consciousness until quite late. I don't even know what the evidence is, but it would be quite late, I think, in fetal development, in which case I'd say then it comes to constitute a person. And it has the remote capacity to have a first-person perspective only when it has the in-hand actual capacity to be conscious and intention, having minimal agency. So that's one. So you don't. That is, I definitely wanted not to just do the pushback to persons to embryos. I just think, first of all, an embryo I think is not even an individual organism because it can twin, and one thing can't be two, therefore it can't be an individual organism. But so I wanted it to be far enough out. Personhood to be far enough out. And I think this gets personhood far enough out to say when an organism, a biological organism, develops the ability to support a first-person perspective, then that biological organism comes to constitute a person, and the person is a new entity. When the biological organism, I guess earlier on, when it gets implanted in the uterus, then it becomes an organism. It's not, before that, I think it's just a bunch of cells. But then when it can become, after about 2 weeks, I think, it's implanted in the uterus, and then I think it becomes an organism, a human organism, but not a person. I think not a person until it gets consciousness and intentionality, at which point, that's the point it acquires the remote capacity to get a robust first-person perspective. At least that's how I see it. The third point, I think it's the third point, you can't imagine your bionic body. I would say this is one place I think I have empirical evidence on my side. This is for a change. The recent work with a paralyzed woman who had been paralyzed for something like 20 years, whole body paralyzed. She was built a robotic arm, had a neural implant, and the neural implant connected her thoughts to her motor behavior. I mean, that is her movement of the bionic arm. And she could drink a glass of water. I've seen this. I've seen, at least, maybe it was photoshopped, but I don't think so. She could actually pick up a glass. She had a crazy-looking arm attached to her shoulder with a neural implant. And the researcher instructed her to think about picking up the glass of water and drinking from it. She did. She picked it up and drank from it. There's more and more evidence that we can be replaced in important ways, in ways that are non-organic. Oh, that's non-organic. Non-organic ways. And that's why I thought that we were near having a completely bionic body. And maybe maybe I don't want to have too much faith in technology. I mean, my computer breaks down all the time. So I don't want to have too much faith in technology, but that seemed to me, that seemed to me that our particular body does not, we're not dependent on having this particular, I'm not dependent on having this particular body. What I'm dependent on is my first person perspective. I don't mean to point to my brain when I say that, but it's I think my brain does support my first person perspective. Now you also made another point which I think is really important, because and that is, I underestimate, according to you, the importance of having this body for having this first person perspective. I think there's one first person perspective that's a property that I have, you have, Mario has, everybody in this room has, and we all have, we have it at the robust stage. But still, we're different people. What makes us different? They're different exemplifications of the first person perspective. So what I want to do is tie individuality to exemplification of the first person perspective. And I would suppose, since I'm a theist, I would suppose that the exemplification of a first person perspective can be had anywhere God puts it. But to be a human person, you have to start off as a human organism. But I think that you can have, I don't think, I deliberately tried to craft my view so that I would avoid both dualism and Cartesianism, and also animalism. I thought both of those were not suitable for understanding us. So it seems to me that I can think of myself outside this organic body, because I can think of, I wake up, even this is a thought experiment I detest. I hate this thought experiment. But anyway, suppose you wake up and you find that you're a brain in a vat. That is, you find you don't feel anything. You're in a sensory deprivation tank or something, or just a brain in a vat. It doesn't even matter to me. You can still think. You can still think, I wonder where I am. I wonder how I got here. Those are thoughts that you can have independently of the particular body you have. Now, there's some thoughts that you can have only because of your body, I think. I mean, lots of thoughts about your body, for example, you can have only because you have that body. But the first person perspective can be, the exemplification of the first person perspective can survive a change of body. That's what my point is, I think. Okay. So I think that's all I have to say.
Thank you. I am extremely sorry to settle into this debate, so maybe other questions, and then, okay, Mario, maybe other...
When that got connected with Lynne, I like the paper very much, and officially Massimo is my favorite Italian moral philosopher, and actually probably the only one, because including myself, all moral philosophers actually do something else, but it's my favorite one anyway. And so Lynne had this example of, we waking up in a different body. That would be just a brain in a body. But I have a more concrete example, the real one. When we are born with some cells. And all cells in our life change. We have a different body at the end. It's not the same body. And we can even imagine, let's use the philosopher's God that makes these experiments, that instead of being just a process, it's an event. So at some point, God just substitutes all cells suddenly in one instant. So there will be two different bodies really, from one instant to the other, but the perspective is still the same, because it's just a summary of what happens in reality. So this seems to prove that it's possible to have different bodies and have the same point of view, because it happens in reality.
Maybe just another question, and then we can read Massimo.
Well, I'll try to come back to this issue in my paper. So,
okay, that's fine.
So I would need 1 hour more presentation in order to give answers to all of what Baker said. I'm not sure to remember everything. Well, the basic fact, perhaps starting from your last point, I think there has been too much and typically analytical discussion on human identity and so on in persons has been in a sense has featured too much thought experiments. I think, for example, I hate the brain and a Vatican sample more than you. Certainly more than you. But I hate teletransportations and anything that simply takes us in mysterious places which we have never seen. You tell me about the bionic heart, of course, but there you have a body, organic body, and one piece which is non-organic. And of course, the philosopher wants to say, well, let's go ahead and substitute the other arm and then the one and then the other. Well, I don't know when you start to be yourself, but my intuition is that there is a point at which you no longer exemplify the same first-person perspective. For example, because you don't have the same brain. And when you don't, because if you have a wholly bionic body, you don't have the same brain. The central nervous system, and that is important for your sense of yourself. So how can you have the same first-person perspective if you don't have the same brain? So there is a point, I would say, at which you have to stop with your imagination and you have to stick to an organic body. And this is my intuition, perhaps, but I guess it is a different sort of intuition, because you simply have the intuition that if you wake up as a brain and a vat, you will still be yourself. I don't have this intuition. I will simply reject the idea. It is simply impossible to me. And all of what we know about the way in which humans ordinarily come to constitute a robust first-person perspective tells us that there is a relevant work that is being done by the organism, the ordinary biological organism that we have, and that we could not have it, even if we can imagine to have it in other ways, because God gives us first-person perspectives by fiat, or because we can construct some PCs that are particularly more complex, so they display some robust first-person perspective, but it's simply imageries, you know. What we know is that people who are the only one, as you say, because God, no one ever saw him, and the angels too. So the people who are the only one who have robust first-person perspective come to have it in this peculiarly organic way. And of course, Mario, we change, constantly change our bodies. So it is not that I wish to say that this very same set of cells must constitute myself. But there is some continuity. Of course, how can you trace the continuity from my body as an infant and as a young man and now as an older one? How can you trace it? Well, I don't know. Perhaps Aristotle would say there is some kind of a form, there is something that, and perhaps other people like perhaps Ancianas have held similar ideas in the 20th century, but I don't want to go into that. The point is, of course, that you continually change your cells, but you, in a sense, there is a deep sense, which perhaps must be specified, in which you remain the same person, that there is the same appearance, the same brain, and even there you're continually changing your neural cells, but there is something that preserves you as the same. And I would say that that something is what accounts for your first-person perspective being the same exemplification of the first-person perspective. And perhaps I should have much more to say. Now, about the fetus and the embryo, in your reply, you did not mention the point on which I was centering my argument. The point is the fact that you rely very heavily in your book on the idea that human infants belong to a kind that naturally develops. So it sounds very strange to me to say that when, let's say, between the 25th and the 30th week of pregnancy, that the higher parts of the brain are developed and the synapses start to function, then something new happens, where there is that explicit and very clear continuity between the fetus before that, and it is the very same kind, natural kind of organism that develops, progressively develops those characteristics. So if you accept that you don't have to actually display the characteristics for I thoughts in your view when you're an infant, you accept that you don't have to display the characteristics in order to be considered as a person. Why should you not accept the fact that the fetus, even before that point? And of course I accept your point concerning the embryos, of course, that is not an individual, but perhaps at 30 days, I don't know when, it is an individual, or if you wish, when organogenesis is completed, that it is an individual. Why that would be an individual of a different natural kind than the individual at 25 weeks of pregnancy, when it has consciousness and minimal agency.
Oh, one more point.
A very small.
Okay, what quick. First of all, I think that nature, I believe in ontological vagueness. I don't think that vagueness is just a semantic idea. I think that there's real vagueness in nature, and I think when anything comes into existence, or goes out, but comes into existence, it comes into existence slowly. Whether it's the universe, whether it's a tree, whether it's a baby, whatever. My second quick point is that, of course, it's the same organism, it's the same biological kind. What I want to do is to show, part of what I want to do is to show how we are unique. We are connected to the animal kingdom, but we're not just animals. There's something different about us. And what's different is our robust first-person perspective, and that is something that we only have. So why do I say that's not just a biological capacity? Because it's a capacity that brings with it incredible increase in our causal powers. Our causal powers are just unthinkable from a biological point of view. Our causal powers about putting people in jail. I know I always go through bunches of bad things like that. Or marrying people. Or I don't know, all of our causal powers, being sinners. All of our causal, not all of them, a lot of our causal powers depend upon robust first-person perspectives, and I think that's part of why I want to make us connected to the animal kingdom, but but something more. And the more we are people with causal powers who have robust first-person perspectives.
Cosa facciamo, Roberta? Ok, prendiamo. So, the last two questions.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed that. I think that my position would be close to your position, but I'm not sure. Certainly, I'm a little bit puzzled now by by Lynne's remarks, because I'm not sure. This would be a question for her, but I would just like to say that one of the points for you is that it seems to me that a necessary condition for being a first person, for having a first person perspective, is having a sense of self, of having a sense of first personhood or selfhood. I don't, you've kind of disconnected them in a way that I don't quite understand, but the second point that I wanted to make was that, and I made it yesterday, that the concept of person has different sources, and at least one of them, it's a kind of honorific. You know, Kant has that. We must treat people as persons. And in the case of early, you know, embryos and so on, I mean, what we are doing there is we are extending the sort of robust concept, if you like, in a way that, you know, we also do this with, or maybe we perhaps should do this with dolphins and others. In other words, that we include them, you know, just like with your family pet. You know, you don't eat the family pet because you make a distinction. I mean, even if it's of the same kind as the animals you eat, you include it as a member of the family, and you have a kind of golden rule: we don't eat family members, you know. And there's something similar going on when we treat someone as a person, you know. So that's the second. It's a sort of, as I said, an honorific or you know, concept of personhood, which works slightly differently from the idea that it is an ontological kind.
Thank you. Yes, I perfectly agreed with your second point, and I did not reply to that point, but you rightly mentioned it. You cannot have the one of my points in the presentation was that you cannot have robust first-person perspective in the precise sense in which Baker wants to have it, unless you have the sense of selfhood, and the sense of selfhood it has its roots in the organic, if you wish, biological dimensions of being human. That was all that I want to say. So the fact that you sever the two parts, I perfectly agree with you. It is one of the problem with one of my problems with the position.
I guess I would say I really appreciate your insistence on the particular body that we inhabit. And one thought experiment, which I think we all know about, is Franz Kafka's wonderful experiment about waking up and being a cockroach and seeing how not only is our body very important, the way we feel things, but also seeing how social we are as animals and how our sense of ourselves is formed by the reactions that others have to the body that we're in. So I just wanted to throw that one in there.
Yes, of course, that is very, very important. How you feel your body and how you see yourself through the other's gaze. So that that novel is to me utterly impossible, because it is something like thinking about being a brain in a vat, very similar, but of course it is very important to have that speculation, because it underscores the fact that your physical presence in the face of others and offered to the other's gaze is so much important for your sense of yourself, so that it is an extremization, if you wish, of the importance of the body, because you can't be yourself with that kind of body, even though that is an organic body, not a bionic one.
Thank you very much.